Welcome to Yoga Display and Transformation. It's been going on for a few years, and we try to have them quarterly, and we try to explore various issues about the experience of living with trauma, loss, and disability. This year, we're looking to bring in outside people and more. And so there's a reason for that too. What I find so interesting is like, as you know, part of the vision is that their insight that comes with living with disability, but trauma, loss, and disability more generally, that apply in so many different places. And so, in a way, we want to invite people in and see the analogous places that other people are working on things that are similar to what we're working on. And it's always good to see company and really smart people doing important, interesting things in areas related but somewhat different. So this year, to kind of lay out what we're going to be doing quickly, we're having Mariah today, which we're about to get to, which I'm really excited about. She and I met last week, and I can't believe how much there is we can talk about. Next time, I think it's May 21st or May 20 something. We're having best-selling author Bonnie Choi come in. She wrote a book on muscle, what moves us and why it matters. She ended up, and Molly and I perused it, the advanced gallery just this last few days. There's a whole chapter where the work of mind body solutions, she came to interview me and actually stayed in the Twin Cities, and it's an amazing chapter. And if it's an indication of the rest of the book, it's incredibly well written, and she really captured the essence of our work, which is actually, I find really exciting, right? In a way that is uncommon. So if it's an indication of what the rest of the book is going to be like, that's going to be a treat. And she's great. I mean, I know her personally, and she's great. So that's going to be the second one, which I really invite you into. Her first book was Why We Swim. It wasn't her first book, it was actually her second, but it was on swimming, which is also a really cool book. I've read that one. She's a New York Times author, a New York Times reporter too. And then the third one, we're going to do travel hacks, and we're going to invite in, there's an organization out there, a nonprofit organization. It's going to kind of tell us a little bit. They're called Wheel the World, and we're going to kind of figure out part of what gap they're filling in and why necessarily. And anyone that's traveled with whatever issue you have, it's hard and it sucks, and it's really great that they're trying to take some of the sting out and the logistical complexity out of it, and they're organizing trips that are more accessible to different parts of the world and all that stuff. And then on the final one, we're going to interview one of the founders and program director of Love Your Brain, which is a very cool nonprofit out there, who we it turns out that they've also, some of their teachers have studied with us, and they're doing amazing work. And Kyla Pierce is actually does a lot of research on the impact of yoga and community on transforming trauma. So that's also going to be a cool one. So this year is kind of lined up with what we're doing and what we're hoping to do today, which then you kind of have an outside person and listen and also realize that good work is happening everywhere. So with no further ado, I want to introduce Mariah Rooney. So Mariah is a trauma therapist. She does a whole bunch of things, actually. But she's also, and I'm going to get into some of this, she's someone that I met she works closely with Bessel van der Kolk, and that's how I met her at one of the Boston trauma conferences. But I just like listening to her, and she's great, and what she thinks about how she thinks about trauma. So before, and how she helps people. And her background is amazing. So we're going to start out. Welcome, Mariah. I'm so glad you're here.
I'm stoked to be here, always.
Yeah.
Thank
And just,
you.
when I called her out of the blue, it's like she just, of course, says yes, because Mariah is one of the people that answers the bell, right? And that's a rare thing, right? And so, okay, so so Mariah, we're gonna try to go through some. I always like to get a little glimpse of someone's trajectory, into it. So you're a brand specialist that's living in San Francisco, having come from Australia, but you're a yoga teacher. You've already become a yoga teacher, went to do a 200 hour, and you're kind of like working in corporate America going, oh my God, it's sucking my soul somehow. I've got to figure out that this can't be it. This can't be it. So then you end up starting to work with incarcerated populations, my understanding, and the prison yoga project. So talk a little bit about coming from corporate America into, oh my God, and then going to
Yeah.
that population because you worked in San Quentin and stuff like that, right?
So I studied there, yeah. So, I had become quite clear that I was losing some of my soul in the work that I was doing that I had stumbled into after thinking I was going to go into criminal justice reform and anti-carceral work, and that things take a turn and you end up in a different lane. And I started studying with James Fox at the Prison Yoga Project and got some
Which is
experiences.
another very cool organization,
Yeah,
everybody.
very cool
He's
organization. I have,
amazing. I
yeah,
get to work with
yeah.
him coming in a couple months. I'm psyched. So that's just
Yeah,
cool.
wonderful org. So,
Mhm.
and through them ended up also teaching in some rehab facilities in the Bay Area and doing some community-based work and teaching with military connected populations and different settings. But that was really kind
So
of,
that part
yeah.
with the military, I want to jump in
Hmm.
quick. I'm sorry we're running through your past kind of quickly, but you also had a friend that came back from Iraq that ended up not being able to handle it, and you lost them, and so that got you more interested in military populations, right? So
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah,
personal
yeah.
connection.
A personal connection. And also James was running a yoga group at San Quentin Prison, particularly for incarcerated veterans at the time. So that was a part of my kind of studying and work with him then too, and losing my friend and having that be a really big motivator for
And you've
me
always been
ultimately
kind of
pivoting.
curious about incarcerated, that kind of, if anyone's honest, we all have the dark side of our soul or whatever too. I mean, what drew you into that population?
Yeah, well, in undergrad, I studied criminal justice reform and sociology, and I am an abolitionist and believe in anti-carceral work and the ways that you change oppressive, harmful systems is from within as much as possible, as well as from the outside. And so it's been and also, prisons and so many of these systems become a holding place for trauma, for unhealed, untended to, ignored, and marginalized traumatic
Isn't
experience.
early trauma the greatest indicator of criminality, right? I mean, so it's
Yeah.
one of the core problems that's going on, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And
So,
also, we don't talk about the trauma of causing harm, How do we actually heal from the trauma of causing harm? Because we all cause harm in
yeah.
different ways. Hmm.
Ooh, this is what I told everybody. This can get all sideways very quickly because it's so interesting. So then you're sitting there as a yoga teacher, already kind of drawn to the body, always looking at trauma where it's held, where it's not being dealt with, in people that are suffering from both sides of it, both being a perpetrator and someone that carries the trauma. So you're on both sides of the equations, right? And then you decide to go back to school, correct, to get a degree and go into counseling, right? So you just
Yeah.
decided time to go back to study. You're not afraid of school.
Not not anymore. At the time, you're in it. It's a different experience, but yeah.
Did your degree emphasize on trauma? I mean, or what?
Yeah. So I started at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco studying East-West psychology, so a blend of kind of traditional Western psychology and Eastern spiritual psychologies, and um, did that for some time, and then decided to pivot to an MSW, Master in Social Work program, because I really wanted to also dig into more of a social justice lens and approach to trauma work and mental health care.
Mhm.
But trauma was certainly always the focus for me, always the through line.
So what, obviously early on, even before you were a brand specialist after studying criminality, you're drawn to the body, right? Somehow as part of a core healing mechanism, even though you end up studying psychology, right? Which and part of, Bessel's work, but also in general, is the realization of somatic approaches are
Mm.
becoming more and more important in trying to help in psychology. I'm asking you kind of an impossible question, but I asked those anyway. What was it? What was the intuition? I mean, to me, I could say it philosophically, right? I could say because the
Mhm.
body's part of conscious, blah, blah, blah. That's one answer. And then there's just, is there a core, just a feeling? Is it an intuition that this is the fertile ground of transformation? Like, is there something that started you out even back then? Because I know what you've evolved into more,
Mhm.
but what was it back then?
I think I think it was my yoga practice, to be honest.
Mhm.
It was the way that I was experiencing my own body and transforming some of the intergenerational things that I carried through my yoga practice. That was certainly, I think, some of the most conscious beginnings.
Mhm.
When we look retrospectively, you can have a lot more insight and awareness of the things that were happening in the background. And I certainly think about in terms of, I'm sure many of you connect with an identity maybe of being a cycle breaker or being someone in your family that maybe breaks certain cycles. And I certainly connect with that within my own family and thinking about the ways that I really witnessed my family members being incredibly disconnected from their bodies. And I knew that even if it wasn't conscious, I think retrospectively, I knew that I didn't want to live that way. And so I was much more engaged in the world through my body than my family was, both in terms of my own,
Yeah.
discoveries and experimentation and adventure and healing and lots of
I know
things.
this sounds silly, but I like saying it this way sometimes. You know what? Minds don't move really. It takes a body for anything to move in the world, right?
Yeah,
So what do you think of it? It seems like such
right.
a simple insight, right? But it's like, no, actually, anything that interacts with the world requires a body,
Yeah,
right? Whether it's
right,
even verbal, whether it's your mouth moving and it's coming out in words. It's like it's one of those things that we tend to kind of miss track of is like, wait, no, everything actually requires and nothing moves without a body, right?
right,
Like,
right,
it's
right.
like
That's our
that's the
vehicle.
core
Yeah.
truth, right?
Hmm.
All right. So then you ended up, this is when that I met you, right? Well, you ended up then going to school and then getting a fellowship at the Trauma Research Center, or what it was
At
called something
the
else
trauma
then.
center.
But
Yep,
like,
in
so that was something
Boston.
you applied for, and
Hmm.
that's how you got connected with Bessel and that whole world. Was
Correct.
that something you just
Yeah.
applied for?
Yeah, so if people aren't familiar with who Bessel van der Kolk is, he is the author of The Body Keeps the Score, and the founder of the Trauma Center, which was a really fantastic treatment healing center in the Boston area for kids and adults impacted by trauma, but also was a really important home for a lot of research focused on various approaches to trauma healing, and many that centered the body in really powerful ways, including trauma sensitive yoga and things like that. So yeah, applied for a
So,
fellowship and it happened. And then I ended up
yeah.
in Boston.
And I remember it was at our meeting that I remember the most clear is that it was at lunch, and I think, I don't know if you sat next to me or we like were outside in
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
courtyard, right?
Mm-hmm. I
And all
remember
of a
this.
sudden,
Yeah.
you have those instances in your life where a conversation starts to spark, and you just know that something's going to continue. Like we've never
Mm-hmm.
quite figured out the forms of our
Yeah.
dialogue, although this is for us coming out in public with this
Mm-hmm.
conversation is like the beginning of something we've always known that was gonna,
Yeah.
and hopefully will actually continue. So I wanted you to tell you that I remember the conversation where I started to
Yeah, I do
also
too.
hear
Yeah.
about that's when you first introduced to me that you were involved in trauma-informed weightlifting. So what we haven't covered is, so before I got two different questions now. One is, um, are there parts, so you have this intuition about body and you go into psychological, stuff and training and trauma. Are there things within psychology? Like, do you have your own take on, is early development attachment theory really crucial in how you think about it from a psychological point of view? You always had the somatic background, which I wish more psychologists started with as opposed to come to, because that I think affects the field.
Yeah,
So that's why I like
absolutely.
talking to you, because you started with the body and developed into psychological stuff. And but in your psychological exploration, are there certain things that you tend to emphasize a little bit more than others?
Yeah, I mean, a number of things. I mean, the body is an obvious one. That's why we're here in
Right.
this conversation. And something that's been a huge gift to me and how I think about just us as humans and how we move through the world and how we navigate healing and also the ways that we tend to our body is this idea that, we culturally are trained with all of these narratives that we are these just ultimately whole beings. And I honestly, I call BS on that. I don't think that's true. I think we are very naturally and organically fragmented and not always and I don't mean that in a pathologizing way, that we have different parts of us that develop in response to our environment, to our families of origin and our cultures of origin, and that shows up in our bodies in lots of different ways, in the ways that we think and feel and identify and interact with ourselves and one another. And so, you say I'm saying this in response to the prompt around attachment or attachment theory, because there's so much richness in attachment theory. It's also a very white Eurocentric researched model and way of understanding relationships, right? So there's a million different ways that we can relationship and that people do in more collectivist and communal cultures and communities. And so it's a piece of the puzzle, but not all of it, but also like our attachment within ourselves and the ways that we develop and adapt and cope to connecting with other people in the world. And I'm not the same person sitting here that I'll be when I hang out with my friends on Saturday. It's going to be a little bit of a different vibe and different parts of me will be present. So
Mhm.
I also think about the relationship between kind of the nuance and complexities of our inner world and what that
So
means
that's
in
part
terms
of
of,
why you've
yeah.
been also pretty attracted to Richard Swartz's work on parts theory, right? Parts.
Yeah, yeah. I'm
That's
not an IFS purist by any means. I think he's done some really beautiful work in the parts work realm, but also about half of my practice focuses on folks with dissociative identity disorder. And for a lot of folks on the dissociative spectrum, there's a need for some more kind of layered and nuanced ways of talking about dissociation
right.
and parts that moves beyond, I think, IFS. Not nothing wrong with IFS. It's just a more expansive, and I think in any case, right? Like the more options we have to understand a thing and approach a thing, the better off we are. So
Yeah.
take
Yeah.
an
So
integrative
what I
approach.
wanted to get across to the audience here is that you have a very wide reaching approach. So as we hone in on like the like for the next part of this conversation, it's that it comes from also quite a unique and full in psychology. You're not just body driven, a yogi that happens to want to help people heal trauma. You've gone from both sides and are converging on a certain way of thinking about it that comes from a wide ranging background. So I'm just trying to get people to
Mm.
get that she's got a lot going inside that head of hers, right? Right. And
Too
it's very
much, too
cool.
much.
Yeah, no, for sure. We all do.
Where's
All right. So I want to shift gears. And so I already mentioned the the trauma informed weightlifting, which is a nonprofit that you co-founded, right, with somebody.
hmm hmm
Um, and that's one of the things you brought up early in our conversation in that courtyard on a sunny day. I can still feel the whole thing. But the one of the things I was struck in our conversation is like after all the things you've taken in and kind of narrowing down into what is your point of emphasis in trying to help people heal trauma, that you're very much, which follows a lot what we do, you're looking to help people have body-led narratives, right? Body-led storytelling. And I like storytelling. And people on the group know that I like to think about things in terms of storytelling in a big way. Um, so talk a little bit about what you mean by body-led storytelling, or however the phrase is that you use.
Yeah. When it evolves, I mean, I often will talk about embodied narratives,
Yeah, there
and
it
as
is.
this kind of encompassing way of thinking about the ways that stories live in our bodies, consciously and unconsciously, implicitly and explicitly. And it's something that fascinates me because, I think about some examples of just even, you know, one of the things that I share with even with my students is the ways that we learn about embodied narratives are not just when you're sitting in a session with a client in a therapy context. It's what do you notice about how a person moves through space? Are they collapsed? Are they looking down? Are they looking around and curious? Are they hypervigilant? How do they move through the space? The ways that we move through the world and hold our bodies in any given moment, one, it communicates a lot about our history, and it also communicates a lot about our relationship to any kind of present context, right? And so I feel really curious about what we can learn by paying attention to those things, by tuning into that both in terms of ourselves and also with one another. But also the experiences that we have in our families of origin, our cultures of origin start to literally shape our bodies. And there's so many stories that I was told as someone who was socialized as female, right? Like about the way my body was supposed to be. It wasn't supposed to be this. And if my body was this way and it didn't match with the socialized norms and what was socially sanctioned, then there was something wrong. Right. And all of us, right? And the same goes for disability, for gender, for various identities, body shapes and sizes. And so there's this like Venn diagram that is messy and constantly interacting around culture, family, story, bodies, that I am ultimately fascinated by. And then it also, in my mind, means like, why wouldn't that be an intervention point to think about how we can evolve those stories in the direction of more liberation for ourselves and for one another?
So what I'm also curious, and as we get in a way, we're going to start unpacking some of the ripe ways that you think about and really powerful ways you think about um weightlifting. But um when you say um like can you say, God dang it, I'm losing the way the thread I wanted to ask, how I wanted to ask this, but like the way that you're saying like you get to re-choose how your body shows up in your own narratives, for example, or you get to the transformation. One of the things that I've found is that body habits are more likely to change mind habits because
Mm-hmm.
when you try to have mind habits, well, I'm going to think positively about myself, right? That energy itself is like inorganic in the head,
Yeah.
has a hard time. It's like trying to inflict a New Year's resolution on yourself. You try to do it from the
Yeah.
top down.
Yeah.
And there's something much more organic going from the body up, right? And it's part of the things that you're thinking about. So, can you say something about the power of the body, not just to write finished narratives, but to start the energy differently? Because
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people in this group, we have certain conceptions of our body because we don't fit into the narrative, kind of like you're saying with your body as a woman, right? You didn't fit the social
Mm-hmm.
norms. Like all of a sudden you think you're part of the flow of a river when you live with a physical disability. All of a sudden you're out of it and you no longer fit and you're trying to change things from your mind to your body, and that's not going to work. So say more
Right.
about why you
Yeah.
think that's transformative.
Well, and something that's coming up for me as you're saying that, Matt, is also the ways that we project onto one another's bodies, right? Like, depending on how a body looks or moves, we will project all kinds of stories onto it, right? This shows up in ableism and gendered stuff around sexuality and expression. Um, and I think that it's important to kind of also tease out the ways that there's tension in that, right? We're navigating the stories that we carry in our bodies and how we can bring conscious awareness and attention to that, and then think about ways that we can evolve those stories. And then you're doing that in the mess of this soup of people projecting stories onto your body all the time as well. And so I always like to think about the ways that those things are interacting and influencing one another. But in my mind, I hope I'm answering the question that you're asking. So keep me on track here if I'm
I'm not
not.
sure what
But
I'm asking, so good luck to you.
okay, cool.
Yeah, there's no
Cool.
wrong answer here,
Great.
right?
Awesome. Is what happens in my mind, and I don't care if this is in the mental health field or elsewhere, that part doesn't matter to me. But when you think about strategically and intentionally using a way of moving or some sort of embodied or physical experience to shift those narratives with intention, right? Like we can talk about yoga and like developing interoceptive awareness and being more conscious of in relationship with your internal world, and sensory experiences and all of, we could go on and on about that. And like, what are other ways of moving that could shift some of those stories? And so for me, part of my journey into weightlifting was like people just like kind of literally strong arming me, pun kind of intended, into lifting. And it had something to do because of projections people were putting on my body. And I ended up moving in that direction. But something that I discovered was it became a reclamation practice for me against the stories that people had projected onto my body within my family and within the environments I grew up in, to say, and hopefully this is okay to say, fuck you to those stories, and say that's not that doesn't work for me anymore now that I'm having these other experiences in my body. Sorry, I have a bit of a potty mouth. I can be better about that.
I actually have never dropped an F-bomb ever in speaking anywhere. So just so you know,
um okay.
we're offended. But yet no, I completely agree. Like that's
Yeah,
one of the
yeah,
ways that
yeah.
you can change narrative, right?
Yeah, and to have that experience, and then there's like the passive experience that we have that can even be like semi-unconscious, and things can kind of evolve in the background, and that's fantastic. That's powerful. But then what happens when we bring intention and awareness and conscious awareness to a process, especially if it's even in like a relational context, to then do it um with intention, right? Like with some sort of transformation or goal or outcome, or even just like orienting to the process differently. Like I could just go to the gym, right? I could just go to the gym and like do what I do, and then I could go home and be like, well, that's just what I do to take care of my body because that's what I'm told I should do. Or I could go to a specific gym that is more inclusive and welcoming to me and my identities and my body, and I could have relationships there and build community if that's available to me. And I could choose to engage in movement in a way that is actually about changing things in my life and changing things in the stories that I carry in my body. And in my mind, like bringing in that layer of intention and consciousness just amplifies what's already can amplify what's already happening. I'm very intrigued by
So
that
what's and
process.
I don't want to get sideways on this because we're about to go sideways on tumbling down an embankment of my bias, right? I think that language is a little bit of a struggle here because in a way it sounds like in a way what you're calling forming an intention is actually the mind finally getting on board with the possibility of how the body can transform your how you show up in the world. So
Mhm,
it's not like often we think we set an intention like the mind's leading. It's like, no, if you actually pay attention to what the body is actually showing you in terms of lessons from body to mind, then if you finally realize that, oh, I could go to the gym and realize the treasure trove of transformation that the body's
mhm,
showing me, which we want to get into right now in a little bit, the way some of the cool, simple, cool ways you think about what weightlifting allows you to do, then it's like forming an intention is hopefully not thinking that the intention's the first. Finally, the mind's getting on the train of possibility of what how the body can rewrite the narrative. And that's part of something that we really try to get
mhm,
across at Mind Body Solutions when you live with an altered mind body relationship is that
mhm.
let the body show you things, figure out what the body's already telling you, right? Which is a
Yeah,
different way
yeah,
than setting an intention.
yeah. Here's a I love debating with you, so I'm going to
Yeah,
push that a little bit.
of course.
I have been in a new relationship to my body in the last couple of years after navigating some temporary disability and mobility changes and things, and a new relationship with chronic pain. And as I've been learning more about both my own experiences with chronic pain and also the science behind chronic pain, the other thing that happens is our nervous system plays tricks on us, right? Like it learns certain things and then plays tricks on us, and it tells us a certain story through our body that actually isn't true sometimes, right? That the injury, for example, in my body story, my nervous system told me the story that my that the site or the cause of the pain was still alive and happening in real time all the time, and it wasn't. So part of my re-education was this like dance that I was doing between my mind and my body all the time to help my body actually catch up and my nervous system catch up with what was true in my body, which was this thing was no longer happening. And the thing I love about that is the parallel to trauma, because what trauma does is it tells your brain and your nervous system that the past is living on in the present and it doesn't stop. And so I agree with you. And I think there's this additional layer of the ways that our nervous system very wisely learns to stay stuck or to remain disoriented because its job is to protect us and to neurocept, to threat detect. And those systems are designed very, very well to keep us safe and alive. And they get stuck, right? And like part of trauma healing, and in my mind, like part of healing from pain and a variety of different things that can happen in our body is actually, in my mind, bringing more attention to the ways that our mind and body are in conversation all the time, and the ways that they can influence one another. So I do agree with you. And I
So
think there's
here's the
like
deal.
another
That's one
layer.
of the things that always gets going between Mariah and myself is that I agree with you, and here's my quick, I agree with you, and right? The nervous system's not tricking you. The brain and the mind are actually choosing to hear certain parts of the input, right? Rather than letting the actual full story from the body come through. So their mind
Yeah.
habits in relationship to what, so we'll talk about that another time. Let's move on, right? I agree with you,
An
and
argument
is
for another
why
day.
that line started in that courtyard, right? I agree with you, and
Uh-huh.
right.
Uh-huh.
All
Uh-huh.
right. So because they are agreements. So getting a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about the storytelling that comes from weightlifting. Like in a particular, we're going to talk about weightlifting here. And by the way, when did you start weightlifting? Were you back as a brand specialist trying to break out
I
of
was,
the soul sucking life
yeah,
there?
I still second. I was a brand strategist, which is a
Strategist, I
little
meant. Yeah, yeah.
different. No, it doesn't really matter, but it was still in the realm of a space I didn't want to be in. But yeah, I was living in San Francisco and I was doing other athletic endeavors at the time, and it was actually during my time connecting with the prison yoga project and going inside at San Quentin sometimes with them and with a transformative justice group. One of the COs from San Quentin also worked at a local gym and wanted me to come do a workshop there to talk about yoga and meditation at the gym. And so they're like, you should start lifting. I was like, I think that's my thing. And here we are. I
Yeah, so
said
it
yes.
started early is my point in your
Yeah.
arc. It was like, and you started to realize intuitively and probably consciously, but then it developed, I'm imagining, it's what I'm imagining, the as you have pointed out to me in a way, weightlifting is ripe with potential metaphor to create body-led
Yeah.
narratives, right? So that's where I kind of want to go to now is like some of the things that I wish I had my notes right here. I do, but not I went to full screen. Um some of the things that you think are introduced, like one of to get you started of kind of the list we went through the other day, like one thing about weightlifting is it also, and it could be anything. That's what I want to get across is that we're talking about weightlifting, but it could be
Hmm.
anything. These insights are
Yeah.
anything, but it introduce and makes you go with self-trust, for example. So let's say a little bit of how it does that. I mean, we don't have
Yeah.
to weigh into these, but
Yeah.
the list of things you said to me, I still have me thinking.
Yeah. Well, and just to clarify around language, the program that I founded is called Trauma Informed Weightlifting, but you can swap out weightlifting with all kinds of language, strength training, resistance training. Like really what we're talking about is the use of some sort of either body weight or external stimulants, but to leverage resistance is really what we're saying, right? But you're not going to call it trauma informed leveraging resistance. You're gonna, we're like attach it to a thing. Um, but also because weightlifting and strength training intersects in lots of different spaces. It's in physical therapy and rehab settings. It's in lots of different sports settings for young people and adults. It's big box gyms that people go to. It's the things people do to be able to safely transfer in their wheelchair, right? Like it's all of the ways that we engage with resistance both functionally in our day-to-day lives and then also the ways that we do it more intentionally, for healing, for rehab, for strength, for whatever. But you're asking a question, I think, about what are some of the things that in my mind and experience might be unique about weightlifting or strength training
Or even
that
just how
yeah,
it's ripe with potential
yeah,
metaphor. Like it
Right.
I mean the self-trust is that I can actually do the rep, right? I mean, I'm trying to
Mm-hmm.
think like real practice. When you say self-trust, that isn't the first thing I think about the big bodybuilder. That's again the story I project on the bodybuilder. I'm thinking more he or she's trying to overcome, right? They're trying to
Mm-hmm.
overcome, but really, the idea that they're practicing self-trust is a whole other. I'm not used
Yeah.
to it that way.
Yeah, yeah. And so the self-trust piece that you and I talked about in my mind is that whenever we do something hard, even if it's just a little bit hard, there is this question of, can I do it? Can I do it well? Can I do it safely? Am I going to do it? Am I going to quit? We have this language around failure. Like there's a question. And one of the things that I love about weightlifting and something that I started to kind of pay attention to and study in my own experience is that every single time I stepped up to the barbell, it was a question. It was always a question like, can I do this? Will I do this? Will I do it well? Will I do it safely? And that you kind of quickly and pretty unconsciously often run through that. And then sometimes those voices get loud. But that in the practice of doing difficult things or working against resistance in whatever way that is repeatedly, you start to trust yourself. You start to trust that there are multiple answers to those questions and that you will be able to tolerate things no matter what the answer is, right? It's like I think about one of my big teachers when I got really into weightlifting and started competing was heavy back squats. Holy crap, like what a teacher it was, because you literally have this weight bearing down on your back and your job is to like consensually lower your body down towards the floor and then push up against all of this weight. But a part of what you have to learn when you do that, and I'm just using this as an example, is you have to learn how to bail, and you have to learn how to bail safely. And that became such a humbling teacher for me because I had to learn that if I'm in a position that doesn't feel good for my body, it's not safe, whatever, I don't feel good, there's something off, I'm going to trust myself to get out of it. And you draw a parallel, and I'll just speak personally, like something that was a part of my family's history and a narrative that I learned also as someone socialized female was you persist in the uncomfortable situations. You put up with what's happening. You smile and you keep going and you ignore it, you sweep it under the rug. And so, it might seem like overly profound to try and draw a connection between these two things,
I
but
don't
in
think
my
so at all.
mind, it was really powerful when I started to make some of these connections to say, no, like I actually get to do this with intention and I get to learn how to bail. I like get to learn how to get out. I get to learn to walk up and say, you know what, not today. That part of self-trust is also learning when to say no and when to walk away or to make an adjustment or a change, because that's a part of me being in relationship with my body, um, where my yeses and my nos are just as important as my embodied maybes. And my embodied maybes are the question mark. It's the question
Right.
like, can I do this? Will I do this?
Yeah.
Will I do this well? I'm going to go off screen for 1 second because my dog just opened my door and it's getting cold in here, but I can hear you. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, so in a second I'm gonna shift gears a little bit to some of the other things. And I want to put a pin in the idea of um of the idea of changing your relationship to resistance, right? In the
Hmm.
last part of this
Hmm.
conversation. But some of the other things you mentioned to me, you already introduced it. You with clients through weightlifting, you can introduce that you can transform your relationship to external stimuli, which
Hmm.
in a way, what I love about the weightlifting or whether it's yoga or something else is that you can like it can literally be the barbell, the resistance. Instead of doing the full set of 10 reps, like you're saying with agency, you can choose to do 8 because it doesn't feel right or the fatigue is
Hmm.
too much. So you get to have a relationship with external stimuli. Did I understand what you're saying, or do you want to say something more about that?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And then there's these other pieces in my mind that I really appreciate about the external stimuli and weightlifting, because for a lot of people who have experienced trauma, being disconnected from your body is highly adaptive, right? When your body has been the source of pain and trauma, it can be a really scary place to be. And it can be a really scary place to bring attention to. I've worked with so many people over the years that even when I was teaching trauma informed yoga, were like that was way too overwhelming to them. To be slow and attentive to this thing that carried so much of their pain was too much.
The afraid of
right?
going inside, right?
Afraid of going inside, right? And so,
Mhm.
what is it that we can do to help build bridges so that people can connect with their body in different ways? And one of the things I love about weightlifting is that you introduce that external stimulus. And so, I'll use an example like because I work with a lot of highly dissociative people where they're very skillful at disconnecting from their bodies because that's what allowed them to psychologically, emotionally, relationally, physically survive was just not being present, right, in the moment that something was
Mhm.
happening. And um, what I can do in working with them and collaborating with TIWL coaches is like help them develop a relationship between the place that the external stimulus in their body meets. So they don't have to go inside, right? Like I can notice a thing as it touches my body. I can feel the barbell on my back and that feels okay. I think about I'll share a little example. This is a client who has given me permission to share some of their story because it's really profound. I started working with this person and they were highly dissociative most of the time, very disconnected from their body, a long history of self injury, um, early childhood trauma. I'll kind of leave it at that. But one of the things that we started to explore in integrating weightlifting into our work together was that it became possible for her to make these momentary connections with her body even through like the nurdling, which is like the texture on a barbell or the feeling of a kettlebell or dumbbell in their hands, right? That temporary experience or even just like the weight of pulling their body down into the ground or against a bench or whatever it may be was enough for them to feel something solid that they hadn't felt really much at all in the past. And so there's a dance that you do in that resistance and with that external stimuli that can help you start to orient to your body in space. Um, and then you can start to move that orientation internally too. But it's kind of an outside in job
Yeah,
for some
and then
people
you
that can
get to
be helpful.
control whether you how much weight you lift, and then you're
Yeah,
getting it to
right.
go. You're rewriting the story to something outside without having to go to all the quiet places where you're
Yeah,
afraid of.
right.
So it's really, I think that's fantastic. Couple other
Yeah.
things
And
go ahead.
oh, sorry, I was just gonna say because one of the things I think that is such an incredible marker for healing is when we can experience safety in stillness and silence.
Hmm. For
But
sure.
it's a long journey to get to safety and stillness and silence for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. There are a whole bunch of I have a whole bunch of thoughts there, but
Yeah,
hopefully we get to a practice here at the end. Couple other things that are obvious, not so obvious, right? To me, one thing that's I think we can say kind of quickly is that the great thing too about weightlifting and transformation is that it's quantifiable,
hmm
right? You know what I mean? Like you can do more reps. You can see progress because that external stimuli allows you to have a reference, right? I mean, there's something about that. Do you want to say anything more about that?
yeah, yeah. I mean, y'all know, like anyone who's been on a healing journey, sometimes it feels incredibly overwhelming, and even the tiny bits of progress don't feel like progress. They don't feel very tangible. They're hard to like grab onto sometimes, and so it's a practice to even be in relationships where those things can be noticed and celebrated with ourselves and with other people. But one of the things that I love is when we can introduce something into our healing and into our growth and evolution that is more tangible because you can hang something on it, right? Like
Mm.
I was able to do more reps. My form was better. It felt better in my body. The weight went up. I was able to do it for a longer period of time. That quantifiable piece, in addition to the qualifiable pieces, can be such like amplifiers of some of the change and transformation that can happen.
Yeah,
In our bodies, but also in like the stories that we carry in our
and how
bodies.
you're related to the outer world. One of the things that, and this is a related story, I like to tell this story a lot, is that when I was first starting yoga and having all sorts of flashbacks as I started to twist my spine, and I was calling my yoga teacher, I was like, going, oh my God, I'm basically time traveling and what the hell is going on? And sometimes this is what I love about any kind of body-led practice is that she would say to me, and she said this with love, just shut up and get on your mat, right? Right? Just practice yoga. You don't have to go through existential issues. And that's what I love about whether it's weightlifting or whatever you do. You can also show up to the gym,
Uh-huh.
and just lift the weights, right? You don't have
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
be in the expanded world of
Yeah.
potential metaphor. You can
Yeah.
just, and the repetition itself does the
Yeah.
work without your mind having to participate
Mhm.
all the time. And I love
Super
that
true.
freedom,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So what had happened to me is that my yoga mat was able to become both the place that could trigger me, but also was my safe place to go when I needed something to be solid. And when both things
Mm.
could happen simultaneously in the
Yeah.
same space, it was like, wow, this is okay then, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So
very,
true.
very cool. Then the final thing, one of the things you already kind of hinted at that I have in my notes, but if there's something else you want to add, um, is is that it introduces a communal part weightlifting. And you said, I already said it about going to a gym, but often you're working with someone and inspiring each other on. I mean, so
Mhm.
it does have a community part.
Yeah, it certainly can't, and some people are doing this at home. Like in
Right.
part, so one of the things, and I've shared this with you, one of the reasons that trauma-informed weightlifting exists is also because we believe in culture change, and pushing back against the toxic fitness industrial complex. So, it's a mouthful, but this idea that there is so much toxicity in the ways that, capitalism and patriarchy and like all of these things influence fitness, right? Movement spaces. They tell us all kinds of stories about how we're supposed to move, where we're supposed to move, where we're welcome, where we're not. Um, we're interested in changing that, changing those stories, and also encouraging people to create more inclusive and welcoming and accessible spaces. So um, that feels like an important part of what you're asking, right? That it's important to acknowledge that some of these community spaces are actually not welcoming, are not inclusive, and are not safe for people in certain bodies and certain identities. But when it is, and even if it's just like one person at the gym, right? It can be set. What we've learned from our research and also just what we know anecdotally and from lived experience and talking to so many people in these spaces is that when we're able to do things like that in community, it again, it's like you take the volume knob and you just crank it up, because to be able to do these things in community and in relationship um, is so powerful. I think about one of my experiences. I was a part of a very queer centric gym, primarily femme, trans, non-binary folks, and there was a culture in that space of celebration. And it didn't matter how much weight you did or didn't have. It didn't matter if someone showed up one day and was like, "I don't have it in me today." There was celebration of that person finding their no and saying, "I'm so glad you're here anyway. Come chat with me. Tell me about your day while I do this thing." Right? That there's a relationality in experiencing acceptance and belonging in our bodies is critically important, because our bodies are often the thing that lead us right into a space of rejection or exclusion. And so to change those things intentionally and to experience that with safety and with welcoming is really, really powerful. I'm also a rock climber. It's one of the things I love about rock climbing, because when you're new in those spaces and healthy gym environments, people cheer you on. They're like, "Yeah, newbie, but you're here, you're doing it, you're trying." And that's a really powerful experience that a lot of people haven't had.
So I think that in some ways is part of the essence of what our adaptive yoga community tries to offer,
Yeah.
even though we do it online more, is that we're trying to be exactly that place where, you know, we're an island of misfit toys and it actually fits. Who's
Yeah.
defining what's fit, by the way? I'd rather be a misfit toy, to be honest. All right.
Yeah.
So in this final part of the conversation, I kind of want to shift something we talked about. Remember, we're exploring what is strength and what we want to get back to is what are the body sensations. So one of the things we do, Mariah, and what I try to do in how I think about all these issues is try to strip down to what are the sensations that come from strength. We
Hmm.
might say strength
Hmm.
itself is a sensation, but no, that breaks down into sensations that are in the body, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Right. And what are the things what are the sensations in that happen? I mean, on some level, gaining strength, whatever we mean strength as, right? and I wish I'd said this in the beginning because where we're ending now is I want it to be a completing thing, but what are the sensations that happen, actual sensations in the body that actually help the healing of trauma? Here's an example, right?
Hmm.
People too often and superficially think about balance as a sensation of counterbalance, right? You actually, are teeter-tottering back and forth, and that there's an accomplishment built into the sensation of balance, right?
Hmm.
You are either on balance or off balance, and it's kind of a
Hmm.
binary thing. Well, think about some of the bodies that we have in our classes. Coordinated movement and synchronized movement are never going to happen in some of the bodies. So does that mean they can never be on balance? Or does that mean that balance can only be psychological? And the answer is false, right?
Hmm.
If you start
Hmm.
to unpack the sensations of balance themselves, and try to help someone hear the what sensation is more as what the balance is as a sensation more as at its core, they can start recognizing the potential of balance within sensations that are quote out of balance when they're in the outer world.
Hmm.
And I don't just mean a psychological thing, like the kind of things, the nervous system. So safety is one of the things that help balance, right? But that's not the only thing. Conditions of safety must be met. But if you're off balance, conditions of safety aren't met, right? And how can like balance within the body or within feeling your feet on the floor and your sitting bones, how can that help conditions of safety for your mind to be in space
Hmm.
in relationship to the weight? You don't want to lift up a barbell when you're physically off balance if you can avoid it. It's going to be way more
Yeah.
stressful on certain
Right.
muscles, right?
Right.
All those things. So that's part of where I want to go. And so this idea of strength creating sensations that we're going to try to unpack, because words are going to be hard here, right?
Hmm.
Because we're kind of at the raw data, right? And then how that goes into um conceptions of resilience. Because I know you have a lot of thoughts
Mm.
about resilience at the same time, right? Right. So
Yeah.
too often, and in our group, well, we've had this conversation, gang, before. We've talked about, we tend to, when I say what is strength to you, and a lot of times in this conversation we've had emerging in our group, in our community for the last few months, often it's the ability to withstand, the ability to get through things, to overcome things, the ability to show up every day. And that's one conception of it. But that's, as we and I talked, you and I, Mary, we talked, it's a
Mm.
little bit unfortunate to think about the only way you know you're resilient is if you're in
Right.
tough situations. So that's the preamble to this part of it. So you're starting to weight lift and you're getting all the things you're talking about, self-trust, whatever. What does that feel like in your body?
Hmm. This is a hard and good question. And one of the first things that comes up for me is the sensation of being able to locate your body in space and in relationship to other things. Because that connects you with the experience of agency, autonomy, and in the direction of choice. Right? Like I can't make agentic, autonomous choices about my body if I don't know where it is in space.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that that comes up for me is because I think about when I would see little kids at the trauma center, and we had these sensory rooms where we would do therapy with kids. And some of my biggest teachers were the kids who were incredibly neglected when they were little, when they were babies and as toddlers and growing up, because here you're sitting with a being who did not, it wasn't just what happened to them, it's what didn't happen to them and what they didn't get and the neglected experiences of neglect and deprivation. And so here you have a body and a being, right, who is showing you. This is gonna make me emotional. I have one of my clients in mind, and this kid came in and he could not locate his body in space. And then the ripple effect of that, being clumsy, running into things, tripping, having kids label him as clumsy and can't do sports and last picked in gym class and like was tripping and falling and getting hurt, all that there were these layers of the ways that that experience impacted the stories that he both heard from other people and that he told himself about how incapable he was. But it was because he didn't get the stimulus he needed to be able to find his body in space. And so
Right.
that was so much of our work, right? Was it wasn't just talking about stuff, it was like moving and helping him have these experiences. And so for me, with resistance training or whatever it may be, like the necessity of having the sensory experience of knowing where your body is in space and in relationship to other things is what
Mhm.
allows us to move agentically, autonomously, and in relationship to other bodies in ways that feels good.
Yeah.
Um, that
And
can
it
feel
also helps
good.
you locate in space. So like when you push against a
Yeah.
weight, against a wall, you're going to feel your lower abdominals and you know what I mean? Like it actually has ripple effects that are not
Hmm.
conscious that actually show you
Hmm.
other parts of your body, which is
Yes.
part of what you're saying for a disassociated person
Yeah.
that all of a sudden
Yeah.
they have a relationship where it creates
Right.
things. And then God, this is where I'm on the edge of a whole bunch. Um and I'm trying to figure out how to get there's that knowing yourself in space. One of the things that we say in our little world of sensations, and when I would do teacher training, is that you really can't expand without boundary. So you're
Hmm.
talking about it in terms of agency, but without knowing where where you end in the world,
Hmm.
and without boundary, you actually can't realize connection. So disassociation skips over boundary, right? And then you end up merge and get in the ether. There's ether in the room, right? And you can get there too fast. But if you have boundary, then it becomes a healthy kind
Hmm.
of expanse and vastness, right? And it's not just so there's a whole bunch of things that map onto what we're talking about. So you're first knowing where you are in space and then letting physical boundary help you realize mental boundary,
Hmm.
right? So is there anything else you want to say? Because I think I'm not that great on mental boundaries. I end up trying to have the world. I don't often advocate for what I want or what I need because I know I don't need much in certain contexts, and so I just defer, right? So it is the transition from knowing where you are in physical space to knowing what you need in relational
Hmm.
space.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's a whole different quality of energy, in my opinion, like where people or minds struggle, but bodies actually don't as much in the same way. Um, is there anything else that you feel that strength? There is the fact that the self-trust part you're talking about, like, and it's quantifiable with weightlifting.
Hmm.
Are there anything else that you would say in the body besides reference? When we say things like
Hmm.
mind enters the body through reference, you're trying to get the body in three-dimensional, the mind in three-dimensional space rather than lost in two-dimensional space, all these things. Is there anything else about the sensation of strength, right? And remember, we're talking about resilience.
Hmm.
One of the things that I
Hmm.
find, and I'm going to try to lead into the yoga practice relatively soon, is that a lot of people don't realize that empty space is a form of strength. You talked about it in terms of not being comfortable with silence. Silence. That's hard on the mind, right? But part of
Hmm.
what you learn in a yoga practice when you reclaim space within your body is that part of the source of strength is actually the quiet. We tend to think about quiet as being a place that, in my opinion, that we tend to think about quiet as being a place that the mind enters. Like the quiet is for the mind to settle down.
Right.
When actually
Right.
some of the best spaces that are the most resilient are quiet, empty spaces that are in the body already, that are actually waiting to be tapped. So like right now, everyone on the call, like you can kind of hold your breath for a second and feel that empty space that you know that the breath is going to expand into. So you're going to introduce movement on take the breath, right? And watch that you can expand into the space that you thought was only still, right? This when you're thinking about retention, right? And it's scary if we don't breathe, it's scary, but you sit there, you think about it, you have to hold steady in it, but in fact, it's a potential to move into. And breath actually does it unconsciously and involuntarily for you. So you're constantly pumping from a confined space to an expanded space. And what's great about the nervous system is you don't have to be aware of it. It's going to
Hmm.
do it for you anyway.
Right.
Not a
Right.
surprise that when people are over influenced by external stimuli, they tend to hold their breath. They forget
Hmm.
that they can expand into the space that they think is wearing them out. Anything else about strength that unpacks that you think, huh, that does something. So I'm trying to say empty space is a
Hmm.
source of strength. Anything else for you? So like,
This isn't a perfectly matched answer to the question that you're asking,
mhm,
but that's because language is imperfect. But what comes up for me is thinking about the ways that we translate stories of capacity, competence, mastery, resilience, whatever, into other spaces, and that the body becomes a vehicle for that transfer, right? So what I hear often from people, let me see if I can say this in a way that makes sense, is what I learned from weightlifting and be experiencing my own strength is that if I can do that thing, I can do this thing. And in my mind, that is a sensory experience because
mm,
it's the sensation of, and the sensation isn't, it doesn't map one to one. I can't just say it's this sensation in the body because I think it's different for different people at different times. But it's the sensory experience of competency, mastery, and ability, right? In any way that then can be transferred, especially when things like we're navigating trauma and disability, which the body stories that we're given with trauma and disability often are you can't do that. You don't deserve to do that. You don't belong in a space to do this thing. It's a lot of confining and restriction and exclusion. And so what are the sensory experiences of inclusion, capacity, mastery, competency, and ability? When we're unlearning or deconstructing those stories that live in our
right.
bodies. Is that making sense how I'm
Yeah,
thinking? And
totally. And the thing
yeah.
that, and we should go to a little bit of questions. I forgot about there's even a question part of this, but like, um, is that we tend to think about strength as kind of closing in and being able to use our will. But one of the bodily things about strength is when you have better boundary, when you know you have competencies. That's a really good word, competency in relationship, this intangible thing. You have the self-trust and know that like strength gives a certain kind of confidence, whatever that means in the body, right? That's an
Hmm.
interesting what that actually means,
Hmm.
right? To allow you to realize that there's openness in the world, right? So it turns out that as you can get claim your own space or be competent and confident in your own space, the world actually gets bigger,
Hmm.
right? As opposed
Hmm.
to I can control it all. When you really realize, when you become really good at yoga poses, you realize that the world's gigantic. People that think humility is to get smaller in relationship to the world, I think that that's a joke. The world's already infinite. You better stand tall or you're being disrespectful to the universe
Hmm.
because you might as well take up space when you actually realize you have your own boundary. So I think there's something about it changes your relationship to openness if you feel stronger from body to mind, right? It's not as scary that it helps the mind. So there's something about that. Now, a group in that Bethany or Molly, have you been following, because I haven't been, um, things in the chat or anything? Is there anything in there that we should
There are lots of good comments in the chat, but I am scrolling to look through questions that I don't see any quite yet. So if anybody has anything they want to put into the
or
chat.
raise your hand quick, and then you can tell where I'm going with the potential yoga practice. And some of it may have to happen after hours, right? So that's okay too. The cool people like the after hours on the show, the cool people do after hours stuff. As you can imagine, I'm wanting you to realize that the pause isn't just for your mind to calm down. Your pause is a source of strength. It's an energy that should be integrated into movement, right? So there's a hand up. I see Bill Sweeney's got a hand up. What a surprise. Bill, maybe he doesn't have his hand up.
I do, but I don't know how to unmute myself on my phone. Hey, everybody. One of the things I was hearing, and I got a little late, and Mariah, I was suspect on whether this was going to be interesting. Matt was selling you pretty hard and strong, and I can tell you, it's phenomenal. It's gotten. I have been wrapping around the idea of ceasing as strength, and I know you touched on it, and I think you touched on curiosity, and I would love to hear some more about the flexibility and the release of as it comes from a place of strength.
Mariah, good luck with that one.
Okay, let me
They
make
hear
sure,
me
Bill.
talk about this shit all the time.
I want to make sure I'm understanding your question. There's
How does
a
strength lead to multidimensional flexibility on different layers of being a human being?
It doesn't always. It
Okay.
doesn't always. In fact, I think sometimes it would reinforce rigidity and limitation and confinement. So I want to be really clear that we're not talking about this universally, right? I'm talking about the ways that this kind of movement practice can be approached with intention so that it does exactly what you're asking, Bill, because the opposite of trauma informed in many ways is right, it is rigidity, it's limitation, it's exclusion, it's confinement. And so taking the lens of curiosity in my mind and applying it to any type of movement or any kind of movement practice means that it's not the binary of yes, no, or good, bad, which in my mind can be incredibly inflexible. It's not that it's not necessary sometimes, but it can be very rigid. It's about the yes, it's about the no, and it's about the embodied maybe. It's the willingness to sit in the question and the curiosity to wonder, right? Because flexibility in my mind is like working with someone who's been impacted by trauma and who says that kind of movement is really triggering and unsafe for me. Well, what happens with over time, if we titrate things and approach things flexibly and with curiosity and allow them to start to have micro doses, if you will, of experiences that could move them in the direction of reclaiming a type of movement or a shape or a whatever, that is flexibility in my mind. It's the ways that we work together in our bodies and with each other to be adaptive, because adaptive and flexibility in my mind they're like best buds when it's going well. So being adaptive to the approach matters. I don't think weightlifting is inherently flexible. I think it can be, but I don't think it is when
But
it's
see,
approached
that's
in
where
ways
I
that
would
aren't necessarily
say
intentional.
that help what you're saying, Mariah, is that although it gives you the boundary and the structure, when it's done well, it leads to an openness into the world, right? You know what I mean? Like, and I don't just mean the physical muscles, but because you have your midline better and where you are in space, you end up being able to be more flexible with interactions in the world, more,
Hmm.
less threatened by,
Yes.
if you know where your feet are when someone's being irritated with you, then you're in better spot. It's not, because you actually know where you are in space relative to
Hmm.
the energy that's surrounding you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I would say like possibly unpopular, well, maybe not in this crowd, not an unpopular opinion, but also there's a thing that we regain or gain if it's new to us in finding the ways that we also need to be inflexible sometimes, because
right.
that is also the finding, right, of the midline and the spine to be able to say, no, this is a boundary for me. That's a no.
Mhm.
Like you don't get to do that. Like, there's a lot of toxicity in fitness spaces. I have men who take my equipment from me in the middle of me using it sometimes, and I have to set a boundary, right? But I have to feel that capacity in my body and that inflexibility to say, you don't get to do this. This isn't okay. So I think there's the
Right.
dance of the ways that flexibility is really important and adaptive, and also the ways that we can become inflexible in the boundaries that we need to maintain for our well-being and our safety.
So before we go to Janet's question, I did want to say a whole dimension of this conversation that somehow in this amount of time we missed was the idea that disability, instead of just thinking about it weightlifting, disability introduces, and trauma and loss, but disability too, introduces resistance in your life in every facet of it.
Mhm.
So a lot of what we're talking about in relationship to weightlifting can easily be a metaphor
Mhm.
exported into the experience of managing a chronic condition, of trusting yourself to try new things, of trying to figure out a different relationship to chronic pains. Like chronic pain would be a form of resistance, right? And
Yeah.
and that you shouldn't just push through it. So although we didn't talk about that, I want you to know that that was sitting right here for picking, like a honey crisp apple, right? That would have been right in this conversation. So go back and do that on your own. Janet, your hand's up.
Yeah, so you just mentioned chronic pain, and this is a fabulous conversation, by the way. I'm so glad I joined. I've had chronic pain for 20 odd years. I suffered with all kinds of ailments, and we don't want to get into all that. And I have a disability. But I wanted you to talk a little bit about chronic pain. And also, I don't know if you have any clients that are older, like myself, that who have been through a lot and now are trying in my case, getting back into the strength mode, getting back into finding my boundaries and opening my space, as Matt is talking about. So could you talk a little bit about that?
About the chronic pain piece?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you Janet, do you mind helping me hone in a little bit on
Sure.
what you're wondering about chronic pain? Because that will help me focus.
Well, chronic pain for me is when I have fibromyalgia. So when I wake up and every piece of my body hurts, right? But I know I have to go to the gym, or I know I have to do some yoga, or I know I have to do something because I know it's going to help me. But it is you said it before, Matthew, it's a source of resistance, I guess. Because sometimes when I go to the gym and I'm in tremendous pain already, I don't want to be there, And so I'm already resisting the actions that are going to make me feel better. And I'm afraid that I'm going to hurt myself.
Yeah.
It's like going into I used to weight lift too. So it's like going into the gym and trying to lift, 140 pounds, which I could do. And then all of a sudden I can't. And I hurt myself, so talking about how that as a part of one's life affects the ability to get strong again, especially as an older person. Maybe that helps a little bit.
It's a great, yes, thank you. And I'm going to read a question from the comments. Hi, Allison. Welcome, Henry. I see you. And the question is, can you speak to working through and with pain? I try to let pain be my guide, but also can see how this can be self-limiting and giving extra vigilance to the pain and continuing the cycle of pain. Any suggestions of calming the nervous system and or working with soothing pain when flared up during movement practices or just in life? So I think there's some overlap here, which is why I wanted to read that. I am not a chronic pain expert, so I'm going to be really cautious in how I respond to this. I have the lived experience of chronic pain, and working with people with a lot of there's a lot of overlap in the Venn diagram of trauma with a lot of things, but trauma and chronic pain and things like fibromyalgia, right? There's a lot of overlap there. And there's a relationality in my mind that we have to develop in any kind of movement practice to learn the skills of discernment around sensation, right? Because sometimes my mind will attach a story of pain to a sensation, and I have to engage in the process of being able to discern, is it discomfort? Is it pain? Is it pain that I need, that is necessary, that is a part of a process of moving in the direction of healing? Or is it pain that tells me like this is a boundary and it's a no and it's a limit and I need to respond and move in a different direction? So it's not in my mind a one-to-one as much as it is like learning to be in relationship with pain in our body so that we know. It's kind of like when I was in intensive rehab for 2 years, and having to have dialogue with my practitioners that say, no, like this amount of pain is actually good. It's good, but like we associate immediately, there's a one-to-one for me, pain, bad, pain, bad. And then there's this other fitness narrative, which is no pain, no gain, which I call BS on, and it's horribly toxic and not helpful, right? So there's a space that we can be in where part of trauma-informed practice within our own movement practices in a relationship with one another is attunement and responsiveness. And an important part of the equation of attunement and responsiveness is discernment, is developing skillfulness around discernment, because that's also a part of informed consent. Like informed consent isn't just what you and I do in relationship to one another. in a setting. Informed consent is the relationship that I have with my body, and that I'm not going to ask my body to do something that's going to cause harm to it. And so how do I get the information that I need to consent to moving my body or engaging with my body in a way that's helpful and not hurtful?
And the other thing you're
So
saying
yeah.
kind of dovetails back to what you said earlier is that the nervous system, quote, can trick you. You know what I mean? So one of the
Mhm.
things, the anticipation of pain actually makes you more likely to do something wrong when you're doing something like in a yoga pose, because
Yep.
you're already like pulling back from the action that makes you less safe as you're doing it. So that
Mhm.
this idea of being able to discern how much of this is anticipation, how much of this is from the past because I've injured here before, and really important, right? What you're saying, that dialogue between and discernment that you're talking about, there are many ways to travel through that, and overcoming it is not the one. Right? That no
Yeah.
pain, no gain. Like, oh, it hurts.
Right.
I'm just going to push. You're going to get injured there. That's an
Hmm.
inevitable, deep,
Hmm.
subtle habit that will lead to injury. Right? And so you really do have to let the
Yeah.
pain teach you and be curious about it without pushing through it. So,
Yeah. I also think it's a deep, it's not just physical injury. The injury that we cause is the injury of like misattunement, right? There's a harm that we cause to ourselves and to the stories that we carry around worthiness, that I'm when I override my body and I do the thing anyway, even when my body is saying no, what I'm communicating in this relationship is that my mind gets to decide and write a story that, like, how it's an abusive relationship. It's an abuse dynamic, right? That we are indoctrinated into. We're socialized into mind over matter, right? Mind over body. That
mhm.
somehow that is like the preferred way to move through the world, but ultimately it in my mind is a replication of abuse dynamics that are alive out in the world, because it tells you that you should have power over this thing, not relationship with. And that's when a lot of harm happens.
Yeah. So is there anything else in the chat box, anyone, Molly or Bethany, that we should, these are great comments and reactions, right? And does anyone have want to put their hand up for something for one of the last ones? And then we'll, I'll hint at what the practice would have been. And those of you who want to stay on for a few minutes, we can do something. But I always err on the side, you can always practice yoga. Right. You can always do that, but you don't always get Mariah on the call. Right. This is where having your own yoga practice actually really matters.
Yeah, there's some
Right.
comments that I think are worth pondering on your own time for sure. We'll make these available to you later too, but yeah, really good insights from people in the community.
So make sure you take a look at them, and if anyone wants to, we're heading towards drop the mic here in terms of questions, right? So if anyone has anything, you can kind of find it, like I find that I'm a slow, like curiosity and being able to articulate questions is slow. So it's not just that the quiet part of your consciousness is a source of strength. It also helps you find words, right? Too. Too many times in discussions and workshops, you don't get enough time to process, to like bubble
Mhm.
and simmer, right?
Mhm.
Which is always oh, there's one hand up. Barbara, quick comment, and then we're gonna go.
Actually, it's along the lines of what you're saying, Matthew, that was burbling for me. This has been such a beautifully rich conversation. And I also find myself struggling with language because my lexicon is not necessarily either of your lexica. And so I'm so grateful that this is recorded to have a chance to go back. But it's been incredible having you here, Mariah. And I'm really looking forward to exploring many things further from this.
So,
Thanks,
Barbara,
Barbara.
launching off from that, like one of the things that I try to get across in all the things that I like to share is that there's a quality of energy and exchange that necessarily precedes and supersedes words, because we do all have different lexicons and we have different connotations, right? And so being able to get to the space that I would call the pause and let the words like simmer, figure out your words later, but knowing that there's a place that you can get to the energy that precedes that doesn't have to have words, that you can feel intuitively connected to this conversation and try to get to where the part of human consciousness that is, a whole bunch of really wise people through thousands of years have said there's something that resides beyond language and beyond words. And it is ultimately, and there are all different ways to get there, but one of them is through the body. So feel your feet on the floor. So this is where if you need to pop off, right? Pop off. And I will sometimes be a good time manager, but I love when things are happening and I hate interrupting it. This is one of my superpowers and my weaknesses, right? But there's a place, and maybe you start to feel it when you allow the exhalation, right? Right, when you start to pay attention to the exhalation, just kind of like allow that when you exhale, maybe you can start to feel that it kind of doesn't just drop, but maybe travels down your femur bones, right? Like the exhalation can go, and there's an opportunity on the dissipation of exhalation to let it go down your femur bones, down your thigh bones, and down to your inner heels. So you watch a couple of exhalations like that, and then you realize that simultaneity is always possible, that the source of action and the source of strength, everything emerges out of the quiet, right? And it's not just your mind. Your mind is the last, not very good at the quiet, right? Right. And so not only do you exhale down and start to use your breath to show you a part of your dimension, there's the possibility of the spark back up. And that's embodied by inhalation, right? So you exhale and let it drop, but then you start to lift and feel your sitting bones and lift up. So, and then still the dropping is happening on exhalation too. And there's the potential. And this dynamic is already mirrored in your breath, right? That it actually allows for the drop and knows that there's an expansion that's happening even when you're holding the breath that waits for you. And you get to partake in it when you back in inhale, right? And there's something really important about the expansion into the unknown of your inhalation, because it's a literal expansion that the body gives you feedback in. So when you take the inhalation, you can feel it into your rib cage, you can feel it kind of lighten the energy. And then there's a constant back to the drop. And this ebb and flow, aren't you glad that your body involuntarily does this for you without your mind's participation? You don't have your breath's going to take care of the core of this dynamic. It's whether your mind can get on board with what's actually happening and guaranteed by your breath. So again, watching the ebb and the flow of what your breath already guarantees. So strength just doesn't happen on inhalation. There's strength on exhalation. The quality changes. Now, one of the things you're trying to learn in asana is that when you start to be aware of the pause, not as just something that your mind has to deal with. So as you place your hands on your table or on your thighs or whatever, where you get a sense of grounding, right? As soon as you start doing that, and maybe you press down on the table in front of you a little bit or on your thighs, already your chest starts to lift a little bit, right? Because that happens without you having to be aware of it. It's whether you allow that space to be felt and experienced by the mind. So one of the things about strength, although you might get there by resistance and having to push against resistance, it leads to a sense of openness. One of the things I hope that asana is teaching you is that your sense of grounding actually also comes from what's empty. It isn't just what's gripped, right? So lift up a little bit. And so again, as you know, I think that like traction and space in the vertebrae between your spine actually is part of what should go into every yoga pose, right? So as you move around a little bit, again, we do this in every one of my Monday classes. You start to move around, you start to just wait. My mind thinks it has to have a gripped relationship to the silence, but strength is actually allowing, as Bill was asking, a flexibility to have a different relationship to what's quiet, and it can be simultaneous with what I know my mind knows to be control, right? And it was always here. So you're doing a little bit of this because you're trying to like open a window. You're trying to go, wait, my mind continually collapses the world, right? And it doesn't have to. And there are all sorts of ways to start to figure out when you allow that the quiet is part of your pose. The in and it, you don't have to just be interoceptively aware, just like you don't have to go, oh, what's happening here? What's happening there? That's the mind trying to do it. You just have to start going like, does I kind of feel better when my chest is lifted? If I lift my chest and soften the inside of my mouth and keep my lips together, teeth slightly apart while I lift my chest, while I slightly lift from the center of the sternum up towards the chin and move the skin and lengthen the back of my neck, when I actually look and lift up for the sunshine that's coming into the room, right? All this can happen while I'm being steady in my body. As you know, as you come back, yeah, I've been doing a lot of this in my classes, like trying to get the fact that so my hands go together. And if instead of thinking my mind's in control of everything, if I just start to feel connection with the heel of my hand, these joints, right, my fingertips, and I use that as what grounds me, and I start to open the skin on my palms, right? Can I let that lead the lift in my chest? Can I keep the chest lifted even as I exhale through my femur bones down to my inner heel? And if you don't have your mind do those things, know they're already happening. The body lights your path, right? It's the source. You don't get to know it. The energy in your body, you don't get to know as well, but it's guiding you. So you're expanding your edges on inhalation. You're going down through your bones on exhalation. And you're allowing that whatever the potential is that you don't get to for sure know directly how to tap is helping you refine from body to mind. There's a profound simultaneity that's possible when you start paying attention to what your body's teaching you. Your mind has to open, but it can't open without the grounding of the body. Good, and then release. So again, come forward onto kind of, and when I have a short amount of time, I end up teaching kind of the same thing over and over again because don't get bored with repetition, right? The body creates the structure that allows the mind the opportunity to keep realizing stuff differently. So my forearms are on my thighs and I press down and I hit down through my sitting bones and I start to lengthen my spine. And I go, wait, there's an opportunity as I feel the strength of the grounding for me to lift my chest and start to raise my head and look up. And as I do, I can drop my shoulder blades and spread between my shoulder blades, right? And I can open. Now I tend to hold my breath when I do that. So now I'm going to let there be a pause here. And then I'm going to try to allow my mind to open to my breath more and use the inhalation to help me expand the chest without pushing my breath to do it. Right? Because the breath already opens things with expansion. And then release, and I go to that relaxed state that gives me a certain version of the quiet. And I want to allow and let this absorb into me. And then I'm going to bring it back into action. So I'm not just going to start my action by pressing down my forearms into my thighs. I'm not going to start it with my effort. I'm going to allow at the bottom of exhalation and the drop, I'm going to allow that the push and the inhalation as I lift up go together. And then my exhalation helps me drop my shoulder blades and broaden between the shoulder blades. So I'm using both the expansion of the inhalation into what the part of the universe I don't really know. The exhalation to help me broaden across my collarbones, spread the space between my shoulder blades. And then back down. And then I go back to my hands in prayer and know the same thing is happening here at the core of it. Bring my hands together, start to open my palms, lengthen the skin on my fingers. I start to allow that I can feel the skin on my fingers, feel the connection of the bones, keep the inside of my mouth soft. So I'm becoming from the quiet into the action. Right. And I have to allow that my lips are gathered too slightly apart. I have to keep open to the dynamic energy of the quiet as I bring it into service with action. Because it'll always go into action. Right. And then release. Now, I've been spending a lot of time lately about trying to bring muscles in relationship in service of the bone. So place your hands on the table if you can, or on your thighs, put your wrists on your thighs, open your palms. But I want you, as you press down to your index bend and roll the upper arm up, I want you to pay extra attention to how it activates the space in your spine. So you're trying to figure out how to practice your strength, not just with the object of squeezing the bone, right? But as you squeeze the bone, notice how it opens the fullness in your chest and the rest of your body. So often we think about strength as the ability to go towards the bone and squeeze it and hold on to the world, but really strength opens the universe, right? It's one of the keys. And so you're practicing an action here in your arms, right? Where you press down things, but roll the inner upper arm. The muscle goes towards the bone, but the object isn't the squeezing against the object. It's the consequence of gracefully moving the muscle towards the bone. And notice when you do it, and you pay attention to that, you kind of do that on a retention. You don't like breathe while you do it, and then it makes you want to breathe. So you start to activate this quieter space. So start again, where you start to activate the muscle towards the bone. You start to get the consequence, and then it invites you for an inhalation into the expanded structure. The breath, it will keep your muscles firing too hard towards the bone for as long as it can, but it also can feed this sense of expansion that's part of the grounding. And then release. And again, when I get too focused on instructions, I forget about the lighter spaces because my mind starts to like co-opt the experience. It starts to go, oh, you have to do this. And I have to furrow my brow and I have to figure out how to do these instructions. And the trick when you practice enough yoga is to do the instructions without having the mind co-opt the experience, right? So again, you're actually grounding, but you're using the grounding and the strength of the muscles to open you to the space in the room. And then you make sure the breath feeds it. Now, when I start to do this, because my mind gets involved, I start to compress without knowing it, the space in my low back. I forget because my mind co-opts the process. So I have to refine the spaces in my spine, the openness, and realizing openness in a closed system is a form of strength, right? So as you're acting and moving the muscle towards the bone, realizing that there's simultaneous lightness in your spine is a form of strength. Openness within a closed system is exactly what your breath will reinforce. Good, and then release. If I don't hold that too long and I start to fatigue, when I start to realize this type of fullness and movement, does anyone else start to tingle? Like I start to feel my whole nervous system start to engage. And I get this sensation of both tangible and intangible wholeness without it having to travel through my mind, right? It just starts coming through me. My nervous system goes, yes, yes, more of this. Yes, please. Yes, could I have some more? It's like, yeah, because it's like there's a part of you that is possible to bring with. And so when you're pushing, when you're using the resistance, let's say you're doing weightlifting or the table, in a way, the pressing against the table is a form of resistance. How you meet the resistance, the way you put it into service of things, how you help it, you feel your skin, you feel your bones, you feel the muscle coming to the bone. And all that creates a more of a gestalt experience within the action that could be done just with physical strength. That gestalt feeling, when you're in the context of a pose, does it feel like vulnerability or does it feel like strength? Vulnerability is part of strength. Being open is a source of strength, not vulnerability, right? You have to allow, in order for you to let there be more strength and broaden your conception of strength, you have to allow that there's more here that's coming in service of an action, right? And that you can tell yourself all day that that kind of openness comes from your mind. It doesn't. It comes from allowing that your body's here, that your body grounds your mind, that the universe was always open, continues to be open, and it can be open and not threaten you. The function of the universe is not to threaten you. Maybe people in the universe, maybe things in your past, but that's not the universe. There's strength in the light, the lighter part. Strength isn't just achievement against resistance. It's deeper than that. It precedes. All right, everybody. Sorry for the quickness of that, right? But practicing the simultaneity of your nervous system. Don't forget your nervous system allows your will to squeeze the muscle towards the bone, and it allows you to be open to the space between the muscles and the bone. And both get fed by your breath, right? Like these are all resources that wait for you, that are waiting for you to realize. Don't just think about this as your mind. It's your consciousness, and it's freaking beautiful. Mariah, thanks so much for coming. I think that
Well, thanks for
I think this
having
worked
me.
pretty well, right?
Yeah, thanks. And thank you everyone for being here, for wanting to
I've
connect
already
around this
disrespected everyone's
conversation.
time. This is what I do.
I think it was time well spent for me anyway.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bill.
See y'all later.
So everyone, let's give a moment if you want to unmute and say thank you to Mariah.
Hmm.
Because
Thank
we're
you,
happy.
Mariah.
We can
Thank
apply. We
you.
don't
Thank you
have
so
to
Thank
much.
Thank
smile.
you,
Hey,
everyone.
thank you, Mariah.
Grateful. Thank
Thanks
you.
for joining
I'm
our
so
group.
grateful. Thank you. Good luck
Thanks,
in all you
everyone.
do.